Uh, Good morning. This is the first presentation of October for DBA Fundamentals. And today we have Edwin Sarmiento presenting upgrade strategies for highly available SQL Server environments. Okay. As always, our sponsor, SentryOne, has awesome products. Go check them out. They have free things you can go look at. They have free downloads, and they have, like I said, great products. There's trial downloads. Try them out. That kind of helps us and say you were sent by DBA Fundamentals. That kind of helps us a little bit when sponsorships come around, and they're the ones that give us all our prize money that we give away. So definitely, definitely go talk to them, and that'll help us out. Virtual group news. Speaking of money given away, we gave away $500 to one of the users that used our discount code, Luis Alfredo Tomei. He has $500 extra that he can use, Amazon gift card that he can use when he goes to pass. We do that every year, and it helps us accumulate enough free sessions with that. We're going to be giving away our second one. It'll be given away sometime this week. We have let everybody that has been to all the sessions in September, except for the very first one, where we gave away a pass session, get an entry. And every time you attended, you get one entry. So DBA Fundamentals Down Under are here. And this is the last session that counts towards that. And I'll be accumulating everything and picking one person out of that. Okay. Pass Summit, again, the discount code still works. You can use discount codes from a lot of different people, but like I said, we try to have a little extra in there so we can give away sessions too. It's in late October, early November. Shane will be going this time for us, so say hi to him in the community area when you're down there. Hopefully you can make it. It's a fantastic trip. It's something that you'll cherish and love forever. Here's some of our upcoming sessions. We have one, strategies to get your maximum concurrency for your workload in SQL Server. That's Down Under next week. 2 weeks from now, we've got the SQL Server or SQL Tiger team presenting comprehensive guide for monitoring SQL Server and Azure SQL database. This one should be a real good one, so please sign up for that one. There are tons of virtual groups. You need to take advantage of this because there's great education out there. Go to SQLpass.org and join tons of different types of virtual groups and languages. SQL Saturdays are great opportunities to get free education close to you, so you don't have to travel. Just go to SQLSaturday.com and check and see what the closest SQL Saturday is to you. It's usually, well, it's almost always, I don't think I've ever heard of it being costing anything. Totally free. You pay for your own lunch, and that's about it. Everything else is paid for by sponsors, and you'll have one full day of great education. Our sessions will be recorded, and they will be available on YouTube or through our archive section. So if there's any extra handouts, you get it through our archive section. If you just want to see the video, you can go to YouTube, dbafuntube.org, and dbafun.org is our website. And then just go to the meeting and archive section. I'm going to turn it over to Edwin now. Edwin is one of the better known people out there working with HADR topics, and he actually worked with us one time and got us to the decision that was very simple. So he's a very straightforward and honest person. Today he's going to be talking about once you get your high availability environment in place, how to upgrade it. And that can be difficult. Sometimes you get things in place that are almost impossible to upgrade. So I'm sure part of it goes into how you set it up as you go through it. I'm going to turn it over to Edwin now. And let me see if I can get this. Things have changed a little bit on the our.
Come on, Steve.
I am not thinking. I told you I'm getting close to 60. It's just in
There we
addition
are.
in addition to memory, other things go too. So
All right.
anyway,
I
there
hope
you
you can
go.
see my screen now.
Looks good.
All right. Wow, we got 100 and I can't even count, but there's thanks everyone for joining us for today's webinar. Before I start, why don't we give a shout out to Steve and Shane for hosting this? I mean, we were just talking before this even got started, and just hosting this, and a lot of people take it for granted. Taking time off of your busy workday to host something like this, that's something to be thankful for. Give a shout out to both Steve and Shane. You know, give the most encouraging word that you can. Yeah, great job. And as Steve was saying, you're the best. I totally agree. And like I said, you know, just stepping outside of your regular workday to do something like this, it's phenomenal. And so, again, thanks Steve, thanks Shane for hosting this. I'm kind of jealous when Steve was explaining how things were in terms of the PASS Summit next week, because as far as I'm concerned, I don't think I am going to make it next month, or rather at the end of the month for the PASS Summit. But I strongly recommend it. If you can spare a week off of your busy schedule, it's the best thing that you could ever do for your career. You can meet some of the well-known people in the SQL Server community, Microsoft MVPs, Microsoft Certified Masters, the engineers from the SQL Server product team. You name it, they're all there. Build relationships. That's the most important thing that I really value out of the attendance. My name is Edwin Sarmiento, and the reason I'm saying I'm kind of jealous when Steve mentioned the thing about PASS Summits, because I am not going to be able to make it this time around, mainly because I can't travel. I've been in bed for the past 2 months now. I broke my leg a couple of weeks ago in an accident, and we were joking about the fact then that, you know, when you're trying to accomplish something, or when you're doing a presentation or speaking, somebody might say break a leg. I don't need to right now. I'm good with just one leg broken. So if you're like I said, if you have any questions, I want you to use the chat window or the questions panel on GoToWebinar. If you have any questions regarding today's presentation, feel free to do so. I see people from all over the world, from Asia Pacific, from North America. Just again, keep yourself awake if you're on that side of the globe. This is going to be an exciting thing. Questions, again, use the chat window or the questions panel, GoToWebinar, so we could address them while we are going through the entire presentation. If time permits, we could still allot some time off at the end of this. My email's there, my blog. I'm on Twitter, I'm on LinkedIn, and let's get started. All right. I remember the first time I think this was way back in 2006 or 7. How many of you remember this? A beautiful device called iPhone was introduced in the market way back then. It's almost about 10 years ago. And you know, my colleagues were always wondering when can they get their hands on that new shiny device. And it's kind of interesting because every new version of the iPhone, they always want to get something they were willing to line up at the Apple Store for like hours just to get their hands on that fancy new thing. And how many of you here are actually excited about the iPhone X? The minute that you saw that advertisement from Apple about the iPhone X or the iPhone 8, you're kind of like, my phone's already old. I think I'm going to need to upgrade. That's probably what most of you are thinking. And this is something that it's human nature. I want something that's nice and shiny and brand new. And the funny thing about Apple's advertising is the fact that they really make it so exciting for you to buy that shiny new thing. Although it's kind of annoying, there's really nothing new with the latest iPhone. There were some conversations online about how some of the features from the new iPhone were actually from Connect, some of the technologies. And interesting how somebody would wait and line up for hours just to get their hands on that new version. Anyway, but the struggle is real though. When a new version of something comes out, you want to get your hands on it. You're excited. You're enthusiastic about it. I mean, come on. If you're still using a very old, I've never owned personally. I've never owned an iPhone. The only time I had an iPhone was when I used to work for my previous employer, and they have to give me a company phone. But I'm not a big fan of buying the latest and the greatest. In fact, I'm still using a now 6-year-old MacBook Pro that I'm using for this presentation. My phone's a Samsung S5. Not really into that. A lot of people would find it a struggle when something new comes out. In fact, last week at Ignite, Microsoft officially announced SQL Server 2017. And a lot of people have been asking me about this since last year. And my common response, and that's because I want to be very careful with my non-disclosure agreement with Microsoft, is I can't comment on it. And so when people are saying, so when is GA? What is this? And I was like, no comment. But last week at Ignite, when Microsoft released or officially announced SQL Server 2017. Now I can call it SQL Server 2017. When they officially announced it, it became real. Now, if you're moving away from an older version, it's now time for you to think about upgrading to the newer version. And in this case, it's going to be, well, 2016 or 2017. But it's interesting how aggressive Microsoft is in terms of the release cadences with all of these versions. Like last year, 2016, was released sometime July. And now, a year later, up comes 2017. So I'm speculating, and don't take my word for it, I'm speculating that the next version will be 2018. But again, this is where the real struggle happens, because nobody ever upgraded their SQL Server databases because of peer pressure. Buying a new iPhone might be, hey, my colleagues are using the new and latest iPhone, why don't I grab one myself? But nobody ever upgraded their SQL Server databases because of peer pressure. And this is where the struggle is real, because you now have to consider application compatibility, you have to consider upgrade support, and there's a whole bunch of stuff there. And I'd like to take this quote from Winston Churchill: "Those who plan do better than those who do not plan, even though they rarely stick to their plan." And I want to look at this in terms of the planning perspective, because upgrading a database in itself is already challenging. Now, if you've done it a lot in the past, well, there's a couple of things that you learn along the way. There's a couple of patterns that you see that makes it easy for you to do the upgrades. But when you think about it, it's already challenging, much so when you're dealing with highly available environments. And I kind of use this, what I call the upgrade project timeline. By the way, what I'm going to share with you today will be applicable to whether you're upgrading to another version or simply installing an update, whether it's a service pack or a cumulative update. And people take it lightly whenever they're installing a service pack or a cumulative update, and I always tell my customers, treat this as if it was an upgrade project, or it is an upgrade project, because it is, in retrospect, it is an upgrade project. So I kind of look at it in the spectrum where you have your pre-upgrade phase. This is where you do the preparation, right? Where you're looking at running a bunch of those tools like like your database migration assistant or the deprecation feature in Profiler, so you could identify some of the features that are no longer supported or are deprecated in previous versions. And then this is where the real work happens, when you're upgrading your highly available SQL Server databases and you're going through the process of upgrading them. And then there's the post-upgrade process where you're looking at checking whether or not the tests that you've done in the pre-upgrade phases are valid, and this is where you could decide whether to cut over to production or roll back. And then finally, the stabilization phase. This is the time when you're now installing your monitoring tools, you're monitoring the behavior of the environment after the upgrade. But this session here focuses mostly on the actual upgrade process. The assumption here is you've already done the pre-upgrade tasks, application compatibility testing, initial upgrade checks, and validating whether or not you can move forward with the actual upgrade. And again, this entire presentation will be focused on the actual upgrade process. So when you look at, and I'm assuming, and I'm assuming you still have some, well, I don't want to assume. How many of you here still have SQL Server 2000 running within their environment? Type in the chat window, yes, I still have that. Yes, I curse SQL Server 2000. I hate it. If you still have that, go figure. I am not a big fan of that, and I had the opportunity to, and Robert was saying, yes, oh yes, yep. As Daniel was saying, yes, sadly. I had the opportunity to upgrade a SQL 2000 instance last year for one of the universities in California, and it's not pretty straightforward. But the thing is, you have to understand the upgrade path, and I'm not going to talk about the upgrade paths here because I'm more focused on the high availability solutions and high availability infrastructures that you have. Kyle was saying, yes, and I avoid it at all costs. This is one of the reasons I still love a query analyzer. That way I don't have to mess around with the Microsoft Management Console with SQL Server 2000. Matana was saying, trying to get rid of it. Yes, we too, Steve. A whole bunch, and again, it's not fun, but when you look at it from, again, from an upgrade perspective, you kind of look at the different high availability solutions. Again, the goal of this presentation is to focus on the actual upgrade process, where we're now moving forward to getting close to cutting over to production for the new environment. And so whenever I do an upgrade process for highly available environments, there are a couple of considerations that I ask myself. And you might be asking, so how do you prepare for upgrades? Like I said, the focus of this is mostly on the actual upgrade process. You have to have several of these considerations. I kind of categorize them into 4 major considerations. Number 1, you have to focus on, well, because you're dealing with highly available infrastructures, you got to focus on the infrastructure. When I say infrastructure, you got to focus on the underlying operating system, the networking stack, the storage layer, and stuff like that, together with some of these high availability solutions that you've implemented for your SQL Server instances. And so first consideration is whether or not to migrate or do an in-place upgrade. Now, I'm so not a big fan of doing an in-place upgrade. I've done it in the past for a few customers. Not a big fan of it because there's a reason why your SQL Server databases are highly available. And you think about it, right? When you're doing an in-place upgrade, there is no turning back, which means if you have a very strict recovery objective and service level agreement, if something goes wrong with an in-place upgrade, you got to make sure that your rollback plan will be as quickly as your strict recovery objectives and your service level agreements are. And that's why I'm not a big fan of it. But again, in some cases, I try to explain this to my customer and say, these are the risks, and this is how our rollback plan would look like. And so it may go beyond your recovery objectives or service level agreement. So 2 things that you have to consider. doing a migration or an in-place upgrade, right? Now, for me, this is my primary consideration because, again, I talked about the risks of doing an in-place upgrade. I mean, imagine the time when we had to patch a failover clustered instance back in the days of SQL Server 2005. And the way it works is you push the installation process, cross your fingers, and hope it works. Because if it doesn't, you're up in spending the next few hours or even days rebuilding a failover clustered instance from scratch. How many of you here have had that experience? I've had that experience before, and it's not fun. And so when your boss or your CIO or your CTO argues against doing a side-by-side migration, explain the risks. And I'm pretty sure that they would understand the reason why I'm not a big fan of in-place upgrades. Oops. The next consideration, so the first one will be, are we doing an in-place upgrade or are we doing a migration? Now, the second consideration is whether or not I'm doing OS only, or rather SQL Server only, which means the database engine only, or am I doing SQL Server and the OS? Now, I'm looking at the question here from Yihalem. Hopefully I pronounced your name right. What will be the impact of container technology on SQL Server upgrade? Is it easy or is it complicated? The thing about container technology, you have to understand, and I don't want to get sidetracked here, but just to quickly answer that question, you have to understand what container technology is all about. It's all about, the concept behind it is all about DevOps. And when you look at DevOps, it's mainly for ease of deployment, but when you think about it, most of the container technologies nowadays don't look at the underlying infrastructure's high availability strategy. And that's why I'm not a big fan of it for high availability infrastructures. But for dev test and not so mission critical systems, I'm all about, right? Again, it's all about finding the right solution for specific requirement. So going back to this consideration, when you decide to migrate the database engine only, or you want to upgrade the database and the operating system, you have to, your upgrade strategy would be different. Oops, yeah, your upgrade strategy would be totally different, mainly because if you're simply upgrading the OS, or rather the database engine, I can keep the same OS, I can do an in-place upgrade if I want to. Again, not something that I would recommend, but it is something that would change the way that you would do your migration and your strategies. The next one will be either to do a same hardware upgrade or a new hardware upgrade. I've done both, and the one thing that I tell my customers is, number one, I don't get commissions for selling Microsoft licenses, so I'll tell you exactly what you need to hear. Not what you want to hear, but what you need to hear. I had a customer ask one time, do I migrate off of my SQL 2008? And this was last year. And I said, don't. Like, why not? We're no longer on mainstream support. And I said, look at your hardware leases. If your hardware lease will be just around the corner, wait until your hardware lease is up before you do the upgrade, because you don't want to be doing the exact same thing twice, right? I would rather pay for extended support than have to do this exact same thing twice. And again, most of those technical professionals are somehow not trained to think of it this way. But a way I look at it is, what we do would be totally irrelevant if there is no business case for it. And so if you're doing a same hardware upgrade, you ask yourself the question, when is this hardware going to be up for a lease renewal? If it's just around the corner, wait until it's ready. If it's brand new, then just go ahead and do the same hardware upgrade. Although, it will be a bit more challenging if you do a same hardware upgrade, because you don't want to be doing an in-place upgrade as well. And that might be a bit more challenging in terms of the strategies. Same edition or different edition? The consideration here is mainly about licensing. Now, in the past, when you're dealing with SQL Server 2008 and earlier, and you're looking at failover clustered instances and database mirroring, or even log shipping, if you consider that as a high availability strategy, your approach would be, let's keep the same edition. But when SQL Server 2012 was introduced and availability groups was introduced, you're stuck with, oh, either I keep my database mirroring as is up until the latest version, and just think of it as a deprecated feature, or pay to upgrade to Enterprise Edition so that you can take advantage of availability groups. Of course, good thing that SQL Server 2016 introduced the concept or the feature called basic availability groups. I don't really know why they call it basic availability groups. But anyway, the point here is these considerations will make you think about the cost, the effort, together with the strategy. And this is something that I want you to pay attention to, because again, as database professionals or technology professionals, we're also focused on the technical aspect of it. We're not even considering, the cost implications, licensing implications, the operations costs associated with it, right? And that's why I started off with those considerations before I move on to the technical details of it, because my thing here is that, to really stand out as a database professional and to really provide value to your boss, your company, or if you're a consultant to your customer, is to look at the business aspect of it and align your technical goals with what the business requirements are. Now let's start off with database mirroring. Let's say you have a database mirroring in infrastructure and you want to upgrade that. How would you want to go about it? Again, one of the reasons I'm including the process on how to create a database mirroring configuration is because, number one, you may still have database mirroring in your environment and you're not thinking of forking up the money to pay for Enterprise Edition license just to move to availability groups, right? I'm pretty sure that your CFO or your CIO or your CTO might not be in favor of that. Plus, understanding how you could do upgrades with a database mirroring configuration can help you deal with upgrades when you look at availability groups. So let's look at how you upgrade a database mirroring configuration. Let's start off with the principal and the mirror. And keep in mind, though, that your mirror is acting as standby and your principal database is taking in all of the database transactions. This is your active database, whereas your mirror is your standby database. Here's a rule of thumb that I practice. Every time somebody asks me, how do you do an upgrade? I always start off, especially for high availability databases, you always start off with the standby or the secondary or the mirror. Because if something happens, that your production or your primary in this case is still up and running. If something happens, you could break, in this case, the mirror or the availability group, and your uptime is not going to be affected. So the first step for this is to upgrade the mirror instance. And again, I'm hinting the process of how you upgrade an availability group. You upgrade the mirror, right? And you wait for a low activity period. You don't want to be doing this in the middle of the day, and you certainly don't want to be doing this outside of your maintenance window. You wait for a low activity period, because understand that database mirroring is copying transaction log records from the principal to the mirror. Now, if you're accumulating a bunch of transaction log records as you're doing the upgrade, when you fail over, which is basically what we're going to do next, is we're going to change, if you're on asynchronous, you want to change that to synchronous so that you don't incur data loss. And the reason, again, why I said that you have to wait for a low maintenance window is because of the fact that when you're upgrading this and you're accumulating a bunch of transaction log records, the failover process and the upgrade process would take a lot of time, which would affect your recovery objective and your service level agreement. Now, once you've patched, you've upgraded the mirror, you then fail over your principal to the patched server. And this is what happens when you're doing this. And again, the reason I'm explaining this as early as now is because it's practically the same thing, whether you're dealing with a database mirroring configuration, a log shipping configuration, or a failover clustered instance configuration, even availability groups, is that when you fail over your principal to the now patched server, the process would involve upgrading the database version numbers, upgrading the database engine, and part of that is running crash recovery. So you're bringing up the databases on the now new principal, right? And if you have massive amount of transaction log records in the databases in principal, that would factor into the amount of time it takes to bring the databases back online, right? And in some cases, what I do is at this point, I would assume that the pre-upgrade tasks have been done, which means you've done this in a test environment, you know what to expect, how long it takes to recover the databases, you timed it. At this point, after failing over, I can now either change my database mirroring configuration to asynchronous to change it back, or if it's a high availability strategy, I'll keep it as synchronous, and then I proceed to upgrade the new mirror. Okay, so that's for database mirroring. And like I said, the reason why I started off with database mirroring and how to upgrade a database mirroring configuration is because of the fact that this is exactly how you would approach an availability group configuration when you want to upgrade a 2012 instance to 2016 or even 2017. Now, what about log shipping? Unless you have any questions on how you would go about upgrading database mirroring configuration, let's go ahead and take a look at log shipping configuration. Now, you might be wondering, why would I even consider log shipping as a high availability strategy? Case in point, it's not about the technology. It's about whether or not the technology can meet your recovery objectives and your service level agreements. Again, the reason I say this is because if, let's say, your recovery objective is roughly about 2 hours, or given 2 hours, this log shipping is good enough to meet your recovery objectives. You don't need those fancy shared storage or those complicated availability group configuration. This in itself will be more than enough. Now, unlike database mirroring or unlike availability groups, log shipping involves SQL Server agent jobs that do a backup, copy, and restore. So log backups are being taken from the primary, the primary, and then copied over to the secondary, and restored over to the secondary. Now you get to decide whether or not you want to disable all of those log shipping jobs before upgrading. In my case, I always disable those jobs. And in fact, what I do is, it's not like database mirroring or availabilities where you could easily swap the roles, right? I'm not about to swap the roles from the primary to the secondary and back just for the upgrade process. I will leave the roles as they are, but just so I'm aware that it takes X amount of time to do the upgrade, then I will keep them as they are. Same thing as what we did with database mirroring. You upgrade the secondary instance, or again, rule of thumb, you upgrade the standby. In this case, it's the standby instance is the secondary instance. Then you restore the transaction logs. This is unlike in database mirroring or availability groups where you have log backup jobs running. Here, when you're upgrading the database secondary instance, there may be log backup jobs running while you're doing the upgrade. So you can restore those logs in the secondary instance, and then you upgrade the primary instance. Okay. At that point, the version numbers for both the primary and the secondary will now be the same. And again, unlike in database mirroring where you could swap the roles, here it's not that easy, right? And so I will keep them as they are and not have to swap the role. All I'm simply doing is disabling the SQL Server agent jobs for some of the log shipping configuration. Now, a question from ELM is asking, is log shipping a high availability technology in the first instance, or you consider it as one of it, or just making passing remark? Like I said, it really depends on what your recovery objectives are. If you have like a 2-hour window or 2-hour recovery objective, log shipping would be good enough for you to implement as a high availability strategy, because you could now configure a log backup job every 15 or 5 minutes, and then your window of getting those log backups restored on the secondary instance would be, if it's 15 minutes, 45 minutes, which still fits within your recovery objectives. And again, which is why I mentioned most customers don't consider log shipping as a high availability strategy. I kind of look at it as, what is the recovery objective? I always start off from the business requirement, in this case, the recovery objective. And if it meets the recovery objective, it's a cost-effective way of doing so. Next thing that we look at is when you're doing an upgrade of failover clustered instances. So we've covered database mirroring, which gives you an insight into how you upgrade an availability topology. We've looked at log shipping. Okay. Now we're looking at failover clustered instances, and I'm simplifying this because, in the real world, you might be dealing with a database mirroring configuration with a log shipping configuration as well. Because when you think about it, well, database mirroring might be my HA strategy, but then I can only have one mirror, and in order for me to meet my DR strategy, I'm going to implement my log shipping configuration on top of it, mixing HA and DR as well. And again, rule of thumb would be upgrade the standby first before you upgrade the main instance. Jacob was asking, in your experience, which option do you see as high availability option for banking and utility companies? Here's the thing about banking and utility. It has changed throughout the years. It used to be mainly failover clustered instances, right? Because number one, that was the only thing available back in SQL Server 7 days and SQL Server 2000 days. SQL 2005 introduced database mirroring. And so if you look at the way Microsoft has changed their licensing model and their feature availability, this is what has driven much of the trend that you see nowadays. For instance, with some of the banking and financial industries, they run on top of virtualized platforms, not because virtualization is fun and exciting, but because of, number one, licensing has become more expensive starting with SQL Server 2012 and higher. Now, if I've got a mission critical database and I'm running on standard before, it's a big leap in terms of licensing costs to move from standard to enterprise. And like I said, the reason I'm saying this is because we technical professionals are more into the feature set and the benefits without really understanding the cost side effects of implementing those features. So you would see virtualized availability groups, and even if it's a dedicated box, it's still running on top of a virtualization platform. And so, like I said, these are different high availability strategies that that you have within SQL Server that you could either implement independent of the other features or side by side with other features. So when we talk about upgrading failover clustered instances, remember that consideration about whether upgrading just the OS, or rather just the database engine, or the database engine plus the OS. Now, if you're dealing with a failover clustered instance, keep this thing in mind. Upgrading the failover cluster or the OS in place is not supported, which is kind of a bummer, because in the good old days of Windows 2000, you can. Windows NT and Windows 2000, you can. Microsoft removed it from 2003 and 2008 and 2012 R2, and they actually brought it back in Windows Server 2016. So if you're coming from Windows Server 2012 R2, you can actually do an in-place upgrade of the operating system. Again, not a big fan of it. In fact, every time Microsoft asks for feedback regarding, the in-place upgrade, even though the feature is there, I always tell Microsoft, look, there's a reason why it's highly available. There's a reason why it's on a cluster and you want it to be stable. Now, if you're doing an in-place upgrade, you don't know how much junk has been there throughout the years, regardless of how good your change management process is. Which is why, again, I'm still not a big fan of in-place upgrade for both the database engine and the OS. So let's look at upgrading failover clustered instance, assuming that we're simply upgrading just the database engine. And we're looking at a multi-node SQL Server failover clustered instance where you got nodes 1, 2, and 3, and SQL Server instance running on node 1 at the moment. This is how the process works, right? You always start with this standby. Again, the rule of thumb that I mentioned earlier. Always start with the standby. Okay? So in this case, the standby could be node 3 or it could be node 2. That's totally up to you. If you want, you can roll a dice and decide based on the outcome of the dice roll whether you want to do node 2 or node 3. The beauty of this is you could do this outside of your maintenance window, okay? Because you're not taking your SQL Server instance offline. But in a two-node instance, a two-node cluster, I certainly don't want to be doing this outside of a maintenance window. But let's say you decide to upgrade first node 3. What the upgrade process would do is it will upgrade the binaries, the anything that has got to do with SQL Server sitting on that particular node. Now, this process involves removing node 3 from the possible owners list. And this is, there's a KB article that outlines the process of removing it from the possible owners list. You have to manually do this, or if you're lazy like me, you script it out using PowerShell. But the idea behind this is you don't want your SQL Server instance to fail over to this node while you're doing the upgrade, because the last thing you want is to be in what I call the ping pong failover state. Node 1 currently has the failover clustered instance, and then because something happened while you're doing the upgrade, it fails over to this node, which is currently being upgraded, but because it's currently being upgraded, it's offline, it goes back to node 1, but again, node 1 is down. The whole idea behind moving the instance back and forth. And so this is the reason why you have to remove whatever it is that you're currently upgrading from the possible owners list. You run the upgrade process, reboot the machine, install service packs. In fact, I would strongly recommend it while you're doing this, you install any OS related updates as well, because while you're taking it off of the possible owners list, you're going to reboot the machine. You might as well do everything at once. Once you're done with the upgrade process, you add it back to the possible owners list. Now, at this point, only node 3 has been upgraded. Nodes 1 and 2 are still not upgraded. So you go and do the exact same thing as what you did with node 3. You remove node 2 from the possible owners list, and you run the upgrade process. Again, once that's done, you bring it back and add it to the possible owners list. Now, at this point, nodes 2 and 3 are already upgraded. You decide to move the failover clustered instance from node 1 to either node 2 or 3. Again, totally up to you. But when you do so, the database engine, this is exactly what happens when you're doing a database mirroring configuration upgrade. When you fail over the databases, the database engine would upgrade the database version numbers. Now, in this case, the databases are not upgraded yet, which means the master database, or rather the system databases and the user databases, have not been upgraded, which is kind of different from database mirroring, because with database mirroring, your system databases have been upgraded. So it would take longer when you upgrade a failover clustered instance compared to dealing with database mirroring configuration or an availability group configuration. At this point, you do the exact same thing as what you did with nodes 2 and 3. You remove the node 1 from the possible owners list, and then you upgrade. Now, this is the only time that you incur downtime, because throughout the time that you're upgrading nodes 2 and 3, you didn't take the failover clustered instance offline. The applications can still connect to the database, and you're up and running. Customers are happy, clients are happy, and so you have to be very concerned about how you do this. And like I said, I suggest, even if it's a failover clustered instance or an availability group, you would schedule this on a maintenance window. Once the upgrade process completes, you add node 1 back to the possible owners list of the failover clustered instance. Now, at this point, it's up to you whether you want to bring the failover clustered instance back to node 1, or you want to keep it at the current node. But again, that's a decision that you will have to make. Muhammad was asking, if you have multiple active instances with different versions on one node, can you choose which instance to upgrade? Yes, you can. In fact, in my online course, Windows Server Failover Clustering for the Smart SQL Server DBA, I actually showed that the whole process where, let's say you've got a multi-instance failover cluster running on, let's say, in a 3-node. Let's say in this case, instead of me having a single instance, I've got like 2 instances on 3 nodes. When you run the installation process, you could pick and choose which instance you want to upgrade. Something that was totally different from the earlier versions of SQL Server, because in SQL Server 2005 and earlier, you hit install, or you hit the setup.exe and you upgrade the instance, you cross your fingers and hope it works. Here, not the case. You could back off if you want, if something happened, and then your database engine is still up and running without causing downtime. Joseph was asking, which site is that course on? I'll share the details with you later. Another follow-up question from ELM: what is your prediction about SQL Server upgrade process? Say next 10 years from now, will it be automated? Will it be seamless? What will be the role of the DBA? I totally get where you're coming from, and this is kind of like the fear that most technical professionals are kind of playing in their heads at the moment. Oh, AWS or Azure or all the cloud providers, automation, DevOps, are they going to replace our jobs? And I'll be very honest with you. I can build a failover clustered instance through an automations template. I've done it a couple of times in the past, and anything can be automated nowadays. But creativity and business decision making is not something that robots can take away from you. In fact, I could build a failover clustered instance on Azure with a click of a button, from start to finish, building Active Directory, DNS, and the storage and everything. But somebody still has to plan that. Somebody has to make that call, why this and why that. And that is something that we database professionals should provide value to the business. I hope that answers your question. And again, moving on, like I said, I'm simplifying things because your failover clustered instance might have a database mirroring configuration running on top of it, or maybe a log shipping configuration, right? Or what I would show you next is a combination of failover clustered instance with availability groups if you're running SQL Server 2012 and higher. Now, Ashish was asking, do you lose data when failover clustering occurs during a transaction or a ETL data load? This is a common question that I get asked when dealing with not just failover clustered instance, but availability groups as well, even database mirroring. When you fail over, right? When you fail over, what happens is that you're taking the databases offline on the primary and bringing it online on the secondary. Now that process is no different from crash recovery, where crash recovery runs both the undo and the redo phase of crash recovery. The only difference, of course, is in a failover clustered instance, you're running both undo and redo. In database mirroring or availability groups, you're only running the undo phase. Now, going back to your question about, do I lose data? Well, here's the thing. If you're running something, let's say you're running a long run, you have a long running transaction, and you got several checkpoints or several commit statements while you're running this, every single commit that's been persisted on a transaction log file, when you fail over to, say, node 2 or an availability group to another replica, whatever is in the transaction log file gets replayed as part of the redo phase. Now, if it's not committed in the transaction log file, then it's gone. Technically, that's data loss. Now, I want to go back to this because, like I said, you could have a combination of failover clustered instance or availability groups, but let's take a look at availability groups first before we mix and match, right? Now, the mixing and matching, I'm only going to be talking about mixing and matching availability groups with failover clustered instances, because when you understand how that works, it's practically the same thing as mixing and matching database mirroring with log shipping, or failover clustered instance with database mirroring and whatnot, this whole possible combination. So let's say your availability group is running on node 1. Same thing, 3 replica availability group with node 1 as your primary. Again, excuse me, only applicable to 2012 and later. If you're running availability groups, if you have a synchronous commit replica, okay, let's say nodes 2 and 3 are all configured with synchronous commit, what you do is you change the failover mode from automatic to manual. Totally different from failover clustered instances from an operations point of view. And why do I say that? In the failover clustered instances, you would use either cluster.exe, not recommended, it's deprecated, a PowerShell, or the failover cluster management console to remove the node from the possible owners list. In an availability group, you have to go into either SQL Server Management Studio and change the failover mode from automatic to manual, or you could use PowerShell with the SQL Server PowerShell modules, or T-SQL. Okay. The idea behind changing the failover mode from automatic to manual is that SQL Server will then talk to the failover cluster API and remove this node from the possible owners list. Okay. Big thing to consider. When you're dealing with availability groups, you do it from within SQL Server, not using the failover cluster APIs like failover cluster manager or the PowerShell failover cluster PowerShell modules. So you change this from automatic to manual, and then you do exactly what we did earlier. Patch the node 3, and then change it back from manual to automatic, patch node, or rather upgrade node 2, and then change it back from manual to automatic, and then your failover, right? Now, if you have an asynchronous commit replica, let's say it's for disaster recovery, right? You're not concerned about potential data loss because you know it's disaster recovery and you've defined your recovery objectives for that particular node. What you do is, well, nothing. You know, the thing is your asynchronous commit replicas are configured as manual failover, which means the availability group is not going to be failed or not going to fail over to that particular replica unless you as the administrator invoke the failover process. Now, let's say nodes 2 and 3 are configured as asynchronous commit replicas. Before you do the failover, you have to change from asynchronous to synchronous. That way you're you don't incur data loss, because when you're in an asynchronous commit replica and you do a failover, the only valid failover process is when you specify the man, I forgot the keyword, allow data loss, which means you're telling SQL Server that you're fine with the data loss. And in this case, you're simply upgrading. So I I don't really want data loss at this point, but again, if you have to change from asynchronous to synchronous for that particular replica before you perform the upgrade. Now, Pablo was asking, which within availability groups, what considerations if we need to upgrade to a new SQL Server version? Now, some of the considerations here, because when you're dealing, and keep in mind, SQL Server 2012 was the beginning was when availability groups were introduced. So you can upgrade from 2012 to 2016 or 2017 directly, right? The only consideration that I have, again, my main consideration is whether or not I'm going to upgrade the OS as well, or whether or not I'm going to use the same hardware or not. Those are the two main considerations when you're upgrading, because the strategies would be different when you're upgrading the OS as well, or when you're moving to a different hardware. Now let's look at combining. Like I said, you can mix and match these different high availability strategies. Let's say you've got an availability group running on top of a failover clustered instance. Your failover clustered instance is providing high availability between nodes 1 and 2. And AG1 in here is your availability group. And node 3 is used primarily for disaster recovery. Now, the minute that you introduce a failover clustered instance as an availability group replica, you lose the ability to do automatic failover on the availability group level. What do I mean by that? Well, I can't move AG1 from nodes 1 and 2 to node 3 automatically, right? That is a caveat that a lot of customers are not aware of. When you include a failover clustered instance as a replica, you lose the ability to do automatic failover on the availability group level. Now, I'm not really concerned about that, because from the instance level, I can still automatically failover between nodes 1 and 2. That's what the failover clustered instance is there for. Now, because node 3 is an availability group replica, no shared storage, nothing, I can't move my SQL Server failover clustered instance from node 1 to node 3. I can only move the availability group from node 1 to node 3. Now, because you lose the ability to do automatic failover, I don't need to change anything, because the failover mode will automatically be manual. And it doesn't matter whether it's synchronous or asynchronous, it will still be manual. So this is what I'm dealing with in terms of the availability group failover mode. So I go ahead and patch that or upgrade that to the version that I want to upgrade into. Run the upgrade process, and then I'm done. Okay. Now here's the thing. I've only upgraded one node of the Windows Server failover cluster. One replica, and keep in mind, nodes 1 and 2 are considered to be just one replica in terms of the availability group. So what do? Is at this point, I'm going to upgrade node 2. Now in this case, I will have to remove node 2 from the possible owners list of the failover clustered instance, not the availability group, but the failover clustered instance, which means I will have to go into failover cluster manager or run PowerShell to remove node 2 from the possible owners list, and then I go ahead and upgrade. Once it's upgraded, I add it back to the possible owners list again of the failover clustered instance. Now, I want you to pay attention to this. The minute that I move the failover clustered instance from node 1 to node 2, I also take the availability group offline. Because keep in mind, though, the availability group is running on top of the failover clustered instance. The failover clustered instance is a replica. So if I take the failover clustered instance offline, it automatically takes the availability group offline. Now, when I move my failover clustered instance from node 1 to node 2, the upgrade process runs, the crash recovery occurs. Keep in mind, we're upgrading the failover clustered instance, which means your system databases, your user databases are getting upgraded as well. And then you could simply upgrade node 1, run the upgrade process. And then once that's done, you can bring it back and add it back to the possible owners list. Now, this keeps getting even more complicated. One of the reasons why I try to keep things as simple as I possibly can is because the more combination you have, whether, again, it's a failover clustered instance, availability groups, or a combination of, it becomes even more complicated to deal with this when you're upgrading or installing service packs and cumulative updates. And so we'll look at what if you have multiple availability groups within the failover cluster. Let's say you got AG 1, 2, and 3, and all of them are running on different replicas. Okay, if they're running on different replicas, you have to be more strategic as to how you would run the upgrade. Now Chow was asking, on a failover cluster, can we upgrade on node of a cluster when a master database is attached to the other with the old version? Now, here's the thing. With a failover clustered instance, you only have one copy of the system databases. Well, one copy of every database, right? So when you're upgrading node 2, in the previous slide, when you're upgrading node 2, there is no database in there. You only have the binaries that you're upgrading, right? When you failover, it's just like attaching your SQL Server databases, your master model, MSDB, TempDB, user databases to that upgraded node. And so that's where the whole upgrade process starts. Right? Now, David was asking regarding AG setup, what if you have distributed availability groups configured in the same data center, but I also want DR in a different data center? I've read and been told you could do distributed availability groups. Yes, you can with distributed availability groups. In fact, I will show you a resource. It's an article that I've written for MS SQL Tips on how to do this using database availability groups. But the assumption there is you're running SQL Server 2016. If you're running 2014, well, you can't do distributed availability groups with 2014. Okay. So if, let's say, you have multiple database availability groups, again, same principle applies. You move one of the availability groups to any of the replicas and then upgrade that node. Okay, same thing. Now, at this point, availability group 3 or AT3 becomes offline. So you have to consider that as part of your upgrade process. Now, I certainly don't want to be moving AG2 and AG3 at this point because, well, I just took AG3 offline. There's no way for me, there's no way I'm going to do successions of taking AG3 offline. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to move AG1 in this case to node 3. Now at this point, AG1 gets upgraded because node 3 has already been upgraded. So next I'm going to upgrade node 1. Patch node 1, install it. Now when I finish upgrading node 1, I know node 3 and node 1 are both upgraded, but AG2 and AG3 are not upgraded yet. So I can decide whether to move AG2 and 3 to either node 1 or node 3, totally up to you. But in this case, I already have AG1 running on node 3, and it doesn't make sense for me to run multiple AGs on node 3 for resourcing and performance reasons. So I'll move AG2 and AG3 to node 1. Now at this point, keep in mind though that AG3 has been taken offline twice. So part of the decision-making process is, excuse me, understanding what availability group can tolerate multiple outages as you are doing this. Okay, so it's one of those things that you have to consider when you're performing upgrades for multiple availability groups within the same failover cluster. As I mentioned, I'm not a big fan of InPlace upgrade for the operating system, and that's why I've always recommended side-by-side upgrades. Even so, if you decide to upgrade the operating system as well. And so when you look at these two, images, you've got a 2008 failover cluster on your production environment, well, they're both in production environment. You can have two failover clustered instances, and you can configure database mirroring or log shipping, right? When you want to upgrade your failover clustered instances. Now, I'm speaking in terms of SQL Server 2014 and earlier, because I'm pretty sure you're not going to upgrade your SQL Server 2016 to SQL Server 2017. I'm pretty sure about that because, again, your finance guys and your managers are not going to agree with the idea. That's why I configure database. I specify database mirroring and log shipping, because you can't mix and match versions of the Windows Server failover cluster, rather the operating system with a single Windows Server failover cluster. The only way for you to do that is when you have Windows Server 2012 R2 and you want to upgrade to Windows Server 2016, which is commonly known as a cluster rolling upgrade. Again, not a big fan of it. I'm just throwing it out there. But this is your strategy for dealing with multiple, or rather upgrading the OS and the database engine as well. The key thing with all of these strategies is to plan. I mean, plan. And considering these four major considerations, whether you want to do an InPlace upgrade or a side-by-side upgrade, whether you want to upgrade just the database engine or you want to include the operating system, you want to do it on the same or different hardware, or whether you want to do it between the same editions or you want to upgrade to another edition. Now, we've only covered the actual upgrade process. I didn't cover the pre-upgrade process. That's why you need to consider your applications. Make sure that you've considered some of the deprecated features. You made sure that the query engine is behaving the way you expected after you upgrade. I've seen this a lot when customers migrated from older version to SQL Server 2014, and some of the things that they weren't expecting because of the behavior of the query, the query engine. So again, be sure to do this before the actual upgrade process so that you know what to expect. Because the last thing you want is scrambling to figure out what went wrong as you're right in the middle of the actual upgrade process. Questions. I've managed to answer a bunch of the questions that came in, and if you do have any questions, feel free to post them in the questions pane. Go to webinar. Yalem was saying something about you're right in the sense that there are a lot of pre and post upgrade processes. Yes, which is why planning is very, very important. Bob was asking, what are your thoughts on using VM snapshots for rollback when doing InPlace SQL upgrades? This is where I tell my customers, look, IT is a team sport. VM snapshots are good considering that you don't have external dependencies. When you have availability groups, when you have failover clustered instances, you're looking at DNS records, you're looking at Active Directory records, and when you take snapshots of the VM, you're not taking snapshots of your Active Directory environment that factor into the infrastructure. The question is, what do you do with that? What do you do when you take a snapshot of the VM and there's inconsistency with Active Directory? That's a more challenging process to deal with. Oops. What else am I missing? Any questions so far? Oops. I keep missing that last slide. Anyway. Any questions so far in terms of what we've covered today? And I'm still seeing more questions. I can confirm you have trouble. I don't have any issues with, I love snapshots, but again, the one thing that I don't like about it is thinking that it's an independent thing that does not have any external dependencies. That's one thing that I don't want people to think about, because it creates a false sense of security. Oh, I'll revert from snapshots, and I've done this a lot even in my lab environment. I take snapshots of VMs, and then when I roll back, I totally forget oh, I have the listener name in here, and oh, the DNS replication just kicked in, and it just becomes even more complicated, right? And that's why it's very important for you to take that into account as part of the upgrade process. When will the recording be available? I'm pretty sure it will be, let's say 2 days from now, just to be safe. Um,
At least in 2 days.
Yes, in 2 days. So make sure you check out the YouTube channel for the DBA Fundamentals virtual chapter. And just a quick second, just give me a few seconds here. The whole, the thing that I've covered here, I talk about in detail in my upcoming online, this is a live training that I'm doing in November and December. The Senior DBA Field Guide on SQL Server Availability, where I cover more details of how you manage and upgrade availability groups in combination with failover clustered instances, and show you how it's done and some of the gotchas that you have to consider. For more information, visit learnsqlserverhadr.com/SQLAG. You can do either the online version or the in-person version, which I'm doing in the Microsoft office in Toronto. Back to you, Steve.
Oh, okay. Thank you. I just wanted to be sure that you had done everything you needed to do. I think that people really need to think about that that course. I've taken one of your courses, and it's great. I haven't looked at this one yet, but high availability, disaster recovery, and high availability are very good things for a person's resume out there because everybody thinks about it. Anyway, we appreciate it. It was a great webinar. We hope to have you back again. We always love having you. I will be posting the recording within a couple of days, and I'll be determining who wins the last free session to Pass Summit that we have to give away. So anyway, thanks. Again, we have a session next week with DBA Fundamentals Down Under, and then another one with our chapter here in 2 weeks. Thank you. Bye.
And thanks everyone for coming.
Thanks, Edwin. I really appreciate it.
No problem. And I'm pretty sure that the recording was, I think the recording was good. So what happens when you do a recording? It gets saved.